When Sarah Palin officially steps down, the governor will be the now Lieutenant Governor, Sean Parnell. Tell us something about Sean Parnell and his record.
Sean Parnell is the son of a former member of the legislature. He's in his 40s. I've met him many times as editorial board editor and had him in as a guest. He will be much better liked by the Republican legislators and the legislature in general because he was a state senator before he became a member of the legislature. So he comes out of that tribe and knows what's expected in the way of treating the members of that tribe to keep them, if somewhat happier, let's say, or just to have a civil dialogue. He's not going to engage in the kind of alienation that Palin did. On the other hand, he is not a particularly dynamic leader. That's well known. He's polite to a fault. Don Young defeated him, Congressman Don Young, in a primary election last year. Young was very weak, very vulnerable. He was in his 70s. There were all these allegations of corruption, and Young came out fighting. He called Parnell Captain Zero, and because of his lack of dynamism. And the nickname stuck. Parnell lost, went back to being lieutenant governor, and now he's about to be governor. And my guess is that he will be perceived as vulnerable by other Republicans and Democrats, and we're going to have a huge field of candidates during the next gubernatorial election.
What does Sean Parnell stand for politically?
He's a conservative Republican, law and order conservative Republican, fiscal responsibility. He showed that as a state senator to the extent that he could get his agenda through, and I think that will be similar here, anti-abortion, gun rights, the tradition of the right.
When Sarah Palin returned to Alaska after her defeat in the 2008 election, do you think she was a changed person, either observing her as a person or, her political leadership style?
As a person, I would make this observation. I don't think anybody could run for vice president or president and play at that level in national, international politics and be at the center of the world and not have it in some way change you. That may just be self-evident. I can't prove it, but it seems that would have to be the case. As far as leadership goes, she was much more contentious, much more argumentative, and much more pushing back, I think is the way maybe we ought to phrase it, that whenever there was criticism, she just wouldn't ignore it. And some of the fights she picked were very minor with talk show hosts and others who really weren't of very much significance, and bloggers. She could have just ignored them. I know that's hard for people to do in general when they feel abused or insulted, but there are times to pick your battles, and she certainly didn't seem to be very good at that when she got back here.
In the Todd Purdom piece, he mentioned something that I figure you know a lot about. He writes that perhaps nothing caused a bigger stir than her nomination of Wayne Anthony Ross to be Alaska's Attorney General. And Purdom says that Ross had called gays and lesbians degenerates. And this was the first time in Alaskan history that a cabinet nominee was actually rejected. Tell us the story of this nomination and why it was so controversial.
Wayne Anthony Ross is an Anchorage attorney who's been very active in fighting for conservative causes. His nickname is War, as in Wayne Anthony Ross. He drives around town, or did, in a big Hummer. He wears a big cowboy hat. He's a big man. He actually is quite charming, and if you met him, he's much milder in person than some of his rhetoric would indicate. Not only had he made disparaging and perhaps ugly, and I think ugly, remarks about gay people, he went to war with Alaska's indigenous people over some native rights questions that involved arcane questions, at least they would be for your listeners, of hunting and fishing rights. So he had probably 16% of the population, that's the Alaskan Native or indigenous people part of the population, against him to begin with. And I've known Wayne a long time. I like Wayne if you spend any time with him. He's a very likable fella, but he went down to Juneau to testify before the legislature, and he just couldn't shut up. He just kept talking and talking and talking and talking, and what all that talking did about his views was digging and digging and digging and digging, digging himself in deeper. And eventually he made some comments about the appointment of a state senator and how that process should work, that shouldn't have been, that he should have just kept those remarks to himself. He made some other remarks that finally the legislature, just in their disgust with him, but even more so with their disgust with Sarah Palin, rejected him overwhelmingly. It was quite stunning, and it was quite amazing how quickly Wayne's stature among legislators collapsed. I think for some legislators, this would be a way of getting back at Sarah Palin for various things, especially among the Democrats. And there were a couple legislators, perhaps, who just took it out on Wayne because he'd been on the other side of them in political campaigns and other issues.